Chapter 23, we're going to be focusing on the evolution of populations. So please follow along with your provided handout and fill in the information as needed. When we get to the section over the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, you're going to want to pay pretty close attention to that. Make sure you have a calculator on hand if you happen to have one, so you can understand how to do the calculation parts of that. Nothing too difficult, but something you do need to be able to perform. Here we're going to be talking about the biggest misconception regarding evolution, and I know that we had spoke about this in class previously while we were wrapping up chapter 22. And that's that living things do not evolve, so to speak. They do have traits that allow them to survive better, though. In other words, they have a high level of fitness. And as a result of a higher level of fitness, organisms that have this fitness can reproduce and pass their inheritable traits on to the next generation. Over time, these traits can increase survival rates of the entire population as they become more common in those developing populations. This would explain why Darwin saw organisms that were so perfectly suited for their particular environment. The graph that we see on our screen follows an example from the textbook regarding the survival of a ground finch on one of the Galapagos Islands. As we can see, in 1976, the average beak length was, it was just shy of 9, 8.59, so we'll say like 8.8, 8.9. The island was struck by drought in 1977, the following year though, which wiped out most of the species of the finch. Of the 1,200 birds that were alive in 1976, only 180 of them survived that drought. Researchers of this time, happened to be Rosemary and Peter Grant, by the way, noted that during the drought, small soft seeds were very short in supply. The seeds that were present were larger and harder. The birds with the larger beaks had a survival advantage over those with smaller beaks. And as a result, the following generation of finches gained that heritable trait. Looking at this graph, we can see that in 1978, the average beak length had increased by just under 1 centimeter in length. So 1978 looks like it's close to maybe 9.6 or 7. Anyhow, an increase by really almost 1 entire centimeter, that's a tremendous shift in a very short period of time. Keep in mind that the finches with the bigger beaks, they didn't evolve, they didn't grow those bigger beaks, but the population did. They were selected for by the environment. Once again, the environment, big deal. That's part of natural selection. As a result, they passed on their environmentally favored traits to their offspring. This particular example is of one called microevolution. We'll be talking about microevolution again in chapter 25, I believe. Microevolution is the smallest scale of change and is when allele frequencies of a population change. So what does this mean? This means that one version of a trait, which is an allele, in this case small beak, large beak, one version of a trait becomes more common in a population and the other alleles for other traits become less common. Now I know you don't have this particular slide included in your notes, but there are definitely things you should be able to do at this point in our discussion. Some of this would be even dipping back into chapter 22. I know we spoke about fitness prior, but some of the other ones you might want to pause and just think about, see if you can answer these questions. The first 3 I think are fairly straightforward. Microevolution is a new one that we spoke about. You might want to take a little bit deeper thought with microevolution for this one. So back to a little bit about Charles Darwin. Genetic variation makes evolution possible. Darwin, we all know what he's known for, Origin of Species. He noted in this book that individuals of a population had variation. For example, one horse might have brown hair and another horse might have black hair. Or you might have just heard my dogs barking there. Another variation is one dog has an annoying bark and the other one just doesn't bark at all. So there's variations even in behaviors. So I apologize about those dogs. Natural selection also acts on these variations. For example, white mice, brown mice live in a brown sandy environment. Natural selection would probably favor that brown mouse because it can blend in more so than the white mice, at least in regards if there were any predators that hunted on their sense of vision. Now, of course, fur color would have nothing to do with organisms like snakes, who don't really use vision for hunting. They use kind of sensory heat sensors. I guess I probably shouldn't say that all snakes hunt that way. Pit vipers do. So despite understanding this stuff within populations, what Darwin didn't understand was Mendel's discovery with how traits are inherited from parents by offspring. So Mendel, he actually published his work on the pea plant shortly after Darwin published his findings on the origin of species, but it was Gregor Mendel that explained how those heritable traits were passed through generations. So, to put a definition to genetic variation, right on your screen there, differences among individuals in the composition of their genes. So what genes do they have? What version of an allele do they have? That sort of thing. One thing to keep in mind is that not all phenotypes are heritable, and therefore if they're not heritable, natural selection cannot act on those. Think about what we talked about with Lamarck back in chapter 22. So variation can come in one of two forms, either discrete or quantitative. Discrete you can think of as sort of this. A discrete trait will be this or that. Nothing else, can't be a blend, can't be a different color. So discrete would be this or that, which operate in a standard dominant recessive fashion. So all of the traits that Mendel was looking at were discrete characters. Quantitative, on the other hand, would be something that's polygenic, controlled by a variety of genes, has multiple versions of alleles, and the phenotypes of quantitative traits occur across a spectrum. So you could have, if we're looking at height or length, tiny on one end, huge on the other end, and everything else in between. So a lot of traits are quantitative. There's way more quantitative traits than there are discrete traits. So as we well know, some species aren't found in just one place on our planet. They can be found here, or there, or there, or over here, or over here, or maybe even on an entirely different continent than what we see on our screen here. Each population of the same species, but different populations, can have different favored traits. So some species, they inhabit multiple environments on our planet, and each of these environments is going to be a little bit different, and as a result, different traits within those populations might be favored. What could this natural selection potentially do to a species that inhabits a variety of environments? Well, it could result in the separation of the first species and the creation of two separate species entirely. Or maybe nothing at all. Right here we see a bunch of butterflies, and we can see that they do have different colored patterns, different styles of wings. What would determine this difference? Well, it is the environment and whatever is favored in that particular location. One thing to keep in mind is that all these butterflies, even though they do look different, it's all the same species. An example that you guys actually mentioned in class the other day that actually ties directly to this would be the skin color of humans. Think about the different geographies where humans inhabit our planet, and you can get a sense of how this might be in existence in human populations. So how does variation arise, and what keeps it consistent in the population? Well, variation is a good thing. Actually, the more variation a particular species has, the greater its chance of survival. Formation of new alleles is typically the result of a mutation in DNA. In multicellular organisms, these mutations must occur in the germ cells, which give rise to our sex cells. And if it doesn't, then those traits cannot, or those mutations, they cannot be heritable. So the only way you could pass those traits to the offspring is if it is occurring in the germ cells. One such mutation that has occurred in humans is the rise of sickle cell, which is the result of a point mutation. There's also altering gene number or positions. This occurs as a result of translocation of DNA. Although this sounds harmful, this is not always the case. If a large section of DNA is translocated together, then many of the genes will remain together and remain operable. There are also changes that may be the result of duplication of genes during errors in meiosis. While these duplications are frankly harmful most of the time, it is believed to have occurred in the remote ancestors of mammals. These organisms had a single gene for detecting odor, these older mammals, and humans today have roughly 1,000 genes for detecting odors. Mice actually have 1,300. The result of this increased ability to detect scent has been beneficial over the course of time, all stemming from altered gene number or position. Organisms that reproduce rapidly are also more vulnerable to higher mutation rates. While the mutation rates of humans is low, I think the occurrence is one mutation every 100,000 genes or so per generation. Other organisms have much higher rates, which is especially true of viruses, which technically aren't alive, but they mutate nonetheless. In the last one, sexual reproduction, we've discussed that in our last unit. Meiosis, independent assortment, and crossing over can all lead to a vast array of possible traits that are inherited as a result of sexual reproduction and an increase in randomness, so to speak.